Hello everyone and welcome back to Nocturnal Narrative Studio. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know which country you're listening from. Without further ado, let's begin the story. Story 1. My best friend, Liam, and I were both aspiring freelance paranormal investigators, which is a pretentious way of saying we were broke college dropouts obsessed with the occult, and our obsession focused on the infamous St. Vesper's Boneyard, an isolated, centuries-old cemetery in rural Oregon, known for its bizarre, almost architectural graves, and the local legend that said the earth there never stopped moving, and for a major social media push, the one that was supposed to finally get us noticed. We agreed to spend 3 nights documenting the hidden, uncatalogued graves using Liam's inherited ground, penetrating radar GPR unit, a very expensive piece of equipment. We needed to prove the GPR readings were real, to show the world that St. Vesper's was far larger and older than the town admitted, and we were convinced this was our big break, our ticket to genuine fame. So we drove Liam's battered van out there, loaded with the GPR, cameras, a heavy-duty field notebook, and enough canned chili to survive a siege. And the initial comfort was fleeting, but present, the first few hours felt like a fun adventure, setting up camp on the high ground overlooking the fog-choked valley where the oldest graves lay, and Liam was cracking jokes, doing fake ghost voices, making the whole place feel less like a burial ground and more like a playground for the morbidly curious. And the air was still cold and smelled of damp moss and iron, and I remember feeling an almost euphoric sense of destiny, thinking we got this. I'll skip the boring stuff, like the initial GPR setup and the freezing cold of the first night. But by the second evening, a sickness started to creep in, the initial comfort dissolving into pure unease, and the small things going wrong were deeply unsettling. I was absolutely meticulous about my gear, yet I kept finding my industrial-grade Petzl headlamp, the one with the bright red casing, turned off, resting on the cold ground 10 feet from my cot. When I knew I had hung it from the tent ceiling, and when I asked Liam, he got defensive, saying I was just losing it from the cold and the bad coffee. And then came the chilling, first red flag. The battery pack for the GPR unit, a specific proprietary model, disappeared from its protective, locked box, and only Liam and I had the combination, and Liam swore he hadn't touched it, insisting it must be buried under the bedding. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that it was gone, and the way Liam avoided my eyes when I questioned him started a slow, cold burn of suspicion in my stomach. That night, the escalating weirdness became auditory torture. Liam was asleep almost immediately, snoring heavily, but I was wide awake, listening to the silence, and then I heard it, a slow, dragging sound, wet and heavy, coming from the direction of the oldest, unmarked field stones, the ones where the GPR had shown the strongest, deepest anomalies. And the mysterious events escalated when the dragging stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic thump against the outside of our tent, always one thump, followed by a long, agonizing pause, and I lay there, rigid with terror, telling myself it was a deer, an animal, anything but the implied human intelligence behind the sound, and I saw a shadow on the tent wall, a massive, distorted shape that wasn't Liam's, and when I whispered his name, the thump stopped instantly, and Liam just shifted and muttered in his sleep, and his complete imperviousness to the noise, his unnaturally deep sleep, started to feel more terrifying than the sounds themselves. The morning of the 3rd day brought the major discovery that confirmed the betrayal. Liam was out doing a perimeter check, or so he said, and my paranoia forced me to search his side of the tent, and I found it hidden deep inside his spare sleeping bag. A battered, heavy, leather-bound journal, not his usual research notebook, and I pulled it out, my hands slick with cold sweat. And the journal wasn't just his, it was his father's, who had reportedly died in a hiking accident near St. Vesper's years ago, and I opened it, and the truth hit me. That's when it hit me. A shockwave of sickening clarity. Liam's father hadn't died near the cemetery. He had died in it, and his final entries described an encounter with a local caretaker, a man of the iron gates, who forced him to participate in a ritual, exchanging a life for the cemetery's continued silence, and Liam's own handwriting was in the back, meticulously charting the exact location of his father's unmarked grave, and beside the chart, a chilling note. The GPR battery is in my father's grave. The ground will only take one of us now, and the missing tape, the deep sleep, the intentional destruction of the GPR unit. It was all a calculated setup, a plan to trade my life for his own freedom from this terrible, inherited debt to the graveyard. The climax was raw and desperate. Liam returned just as I was frantically strapping the tent poles and a spare shovel to my back, and I confronted him, shoving the journal into his chest, screaming that I knew what he was doing, and he didn't even look surprised. Just a deep, terrible resignation in his eyes, and he grabbed the shovel. His face twisted in a look of profound fear and dark resolve, and he came at me, swinging, determined to fulfill his legacy, to make me the exchange, and we struggled in the cold, damp morning air, fighting right on the boundary of the uncatalogued graves, and I yelled, looking back though, "You were never my friend. You were just bait." And the sound of my screaming finally drew adult involvement, as two park rangers, who were thankfully doing a routine trail maintenance check far off the known path, heard the noise and came running through the fog, their official, authoritative voices cutting through the terror, and they saw Liam, wild-eyed, standing over me with the shovel, his face streaked with tears and dirt, and they quickly subdued him, calling for immediate assistance. And as they pulled him away, I looked down at the earth where we had been struggling, and there, partially exposed by the scuffle, was the corroded iron head of the GPR battery pack, placed there with dark, deliberate intent. Liam was eventually institutionalized, not jailed, the official story being a severe drug-induced psychotic break in the isolated woods, and the authority figures, the local police, just chalked up the ranger's report to a misunderstanding under extreme duress, quickly dismissing the cryptic entries and the bizarre events as the ramblings of a sick mind. But I know the truth, and the ongoing fear is a cold, daily reminder. I moved across the country, changed my name, and rebuilt my life, but 2 weeks ago, I received a small, beautifully carved stone box in the mail, unmarked and cold to the touch, and inside was a single tiny, perfectly polished fieldstone, the kind of stone used to mark the unmarked graves in St. Vespers, and etched into the stone was a new, spidery spiral symbol, and beneath it, a chilling message written in ink that smelled of damp earth. The man of the iron gate sends his regards. The debt is only transferred, not paid. And I haven't slept right since, knowing that the price for St. Vesper's silence is still due, and that Liam's terrible inheritance is now permanently mine. Story 2: We are the kindred of the stone, a family unit bound not by blood, but by an unwavering devotion to the resting places of the forgotten, and our headquarters is the massive, crumbling Oakhaven mausoleum, a fortress of granite and grief on the north edge of the city. And I have to be defensive about this, because people think we're weird, a cult, but we're just keepers, maintaining the silence and integrity of the necropolis. And my father, the current custodian, ensured our family group setup was rigid and devoted, every member wearing a heavy, gray woolen cowl and a silver-plated name badge, a strange mix of monk and security guard. But the system kept us safe. It kept the peace, or so we believed. The activity rules for our sacred task, the silent watch, are complex and non-negotiable. First, you must enter the grounds exactly at 11:37 p.m., the precise moment the clock in the main bell tower stops, and you must carry the specific, antique brass lantern, filled with purified oil, and the most important and most detailed rule. When walking the rows, you must maintain a precise pace, 27 inches per step. And if you hear a sound that is not the rustle of the cowl, the soft click of your stride counter, or the wind in the cypresses, you must immediately drop the lantern, kneel, and recite the litany of the hidden names, a long, whispered prayer that supposedly renders you invisible to whatever is moving in the dark. And these rules weren't tradition, they were survival protocols, designed to deal with the inevitable unsettling presences that gather after dark. My first time on solo watch was last month, after 3 years of intense training, and I felt the weight of the silver name badge, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and pride, and my initial participation was driven by the strategy of adherence. I started with the Weeper's Quadrant, moving along the path, the brass lantern casting a weak, golden pool of light, and the stride counter on my belt clicked softly, perfectly timing my 27-inch steps, and I was concentrating so hard on the technical details, the rhythm, the silence, that I barely registered the cold, and I heard the distant, low humming of my two cousins checking the southern crypts, a sound that always felt like a thread of safety in the vast darkness, and I was nearly 3 hours in, feeling a strong, almost religious calm when the rules started to fail and the known world started to fray. Something's wrong. Around 2 m, I passed a small, upright marble column, one I knew was plot 117, a new burial from last spring, and I heard a sound that didn't belong, a faint, tiny giggle, high and sharp, like glass breaking, and it wasn't a wind sound. It wasn't the sound of the watch, and I froze, my stride counter clicking over the number 5231, and I looked at plot 117 and saw that the small, carved lamb statue on the grave was gone, replaced by a single dark, sticky smear on the white marble, and the giggling came again, closer this time, just past the next line of crypts, and the presence that didn't belong was terrifyingly childlike, a sound that should have been innocent, but was filled with malice, and I told myself it was some morbid teenagers, some dark tourists, anything but what I knew in my core it was. A breach, a hungry thing hunting in the silence. I immediately dropped the brass lantern, which extinguished with a soft clink, plunging me into absolute darkness, and I dropped to my knees, starting the litany, my voice a shaking whisper in the vast, consuming dark, and that's when the realization hit me, a punch of cold dread, understanding the truth. The threat wasn't from trusted people. The thing giggling and moving wasn't a living person breaking the rules, because as I was whispering the litany, I heard the footsteps, and they weren't the heavy, purposeful steps of the custodians. They were light, quick, and unnervingly close, and they weren't 27 inches. They were tiny, hopping steps, and they were running toward me, and I felt a wave of freezing air wash over me, a smell of damp, sweet dirt and something metallic. And I knew that the litany, the protocol, all the rules only worked against the known dead, the respectful dead, and this thing was something new. Something that was actively hunting the keepers. The chasey escape was a frantic, desperate surge of pure terror. I scrambled to my feet, abandoning the litany, and I ran blindly toward the only source of light I knew, the faint, distant hum of my cousin's lamps near the southern crypts, and the intense sequence was a blur of sound and fear, the rapid, light footsteps hitting the ground right behind me, and I remember hearing the giggling morph into a high, pitched, wet shriek, a sound of pure, unadulterated hunger. And I darted between the massive granite obelisks, using them as cover, trying to confuse the creature, and I heard a metallic thwack as the thing slammed into a monument I had just passed, and I screamed out my cousin's name, breaking the sacred rule of silence, a sound that felt like the final, desperate surrender, and I burst through the final line of cypresses, hitting the pavement near the southern crypts, collapsing at my horrified cousin's feet, my silver badge flashing faintly in the weak lantern light. And the last thing I saw before they dragged me away was the small, hunched figure, standing perfectly still at the edge of the trees, its body outlined in shadow, holding something small and white up to its unseen face. The aftermath was a nightmare of denial and fear. The group response from the kindred was immediate and cold. They insisted I was hallucinating, that the solitude and the cold air had broken my mind, and my father, the custodian, grounded me indefinitely, taking my badge and lantern. And the unresolved mystery is worse than the night itself. We never found the tiny statue of the lamb, and the Oakhaven clock still stops at 11:37 p.m., but no one speaks of the giggling. No one acknowledges the fear that the threat is now hunting us from within the grounds we swore to protect, and the silence is deafening. And then, last week, a fresh, chilling sign appeared. I was finally allowed out of the grounds, working the day shift just outside the main gate, and resting on the roof of the massive granite mausoleum. Right above my father's window was a single, small white marble lamb, perfectly clean, perfectly placed, and stuck into the neck of the statue was a tiny, folded piece of silver paper, and written on it in what looked like a shaky, almost childlike hand was the message, "The susto danis next." And I know that the giggling is still in Oakhaven, that it watched me leave, and that my family's sacred tradition is now its hunting ground. Story 3. The motivation set up for me and my two friends, Finn and Jess, was a desperate grab for attention and financial stability. We were aspiring urban explorers and history documentalists, but our YouTube channel, The Folly Files, was stagnating. All drone footage of abandoned factories and forgotten bridges, and we needed a major score, a story so intensely terrifying that it would finally push us into the monetization sweet spot. And we were struggling, living paycheck to paycheck, the social pressure from other, more successful channels pushing us to take bigger and bigger risks, and the financial constraints were crushing, making us blind to the glaring red flags of the next opportunity. The planning phase involved a tip about an intensely remote, unmarked burial ground called the Silent Plot, deep in the Louisiana Bayou, a place supposedly reserved for the victims of a series of unsolved 1930s murders, and the location was perfect. Isolated, chilling, and undocumented, and the group dynamics were strained. Jess was anxious, constantly questioning the ethics and the safety, while Finn was the fearless, almost arrogant leader, driven by the numbers saying, the money wasn't worth it, but the views will be. And we spent a week gathering all our specialized, expensive gear, including a high-grade thermal camera and a suite of audio recording equipment, and we found the contact, an incredibly shady local historian named Mr. Delacroix, who gave us the coordinates and a final, unnerving warning: do not disturb the earth, the sleepers are angry, a warning we, in our hubris, chose to ignore. Our arrival and first day was a baptism in suffocating atmosphere. The journey itself was an ordeal, a 3-hour slog through thick, stinking marshland until we reached a small, dry clearing surrounded by skeletal cypress trees, draped in Spanish moss, and the setting description was terrifying. The Silent Plot was not a field of stones, but a field of shallow, overgrown depressions, each one marked by a single, water-logged stump, and the air was thick, heavy, and silent, smelling intensely of swamp water and something sickeningly sweet, almost like jasmine and rot, and the initial atmosphere felt less like history and more like a waiting room for death, the silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure on our eardrums. And we set up our 3-man dome tent, the fabric seeming to absorb the surrounding shadows, and I remember turning on the thermal camera for the first time, seeing the ground glowing with bizarre, cold patches that defied logical explanation. The building tension started on the first night, small conflicts breaking out immediately. Jess was panicked, insisting she heard someone whispering her name from the marsh, but Finn, focused only on the cameras, snapped at her, saying she was going to ruin the audio, and the isolation was absolute. Our satellite phone was dead, cut off by the deep tree canopy, and the conflicts grew with the realization that something felt profoundly off. The moss-draped trees seemed to lean in, their shapes twisting into impossible silhouettes, and the thermal camera, which should have shown the ground cooling evenly, kept flashing with sudden, violent spikes of zero heat, colder than the air itself, concentrated over the deepest depressions, and I knew deep down that the anger Mr. Delacroix warned us about wasn't abstract. It was a physical presence that resented our intrusion into its quiet. The first incident was a terrifying, directed sign around midnight on night 2. We were all inside the tent, huddled over the audio receiver, when we heard a low, resonant thrumming sound coming from deep within the Silent Plot, and the mysterious lights appeared first, a faint, flickering light, like a dying lantern, moving slowly between the cypress stumps, and then the inexplicable phenomena started. The thrumming grew louder, vibrating the ground beneath our tent, and our audio equipment suddenly screeched, overloading, and then fell silent dead, and I grabbed the thermal camera, aiming it at the light, and I saw a figure, tall and impossibly thin, silhouetted against the dark marsh, but it wasn't glowing with heat. It was an absolute, pitch-black void against the thermal spectrum, a cold shadow walking the plot, and the thrumming was coming from it, a deep, resonant sound like a giant, angry heartbeat coming from the earth. The escalation was a direct, violent threat. The figure started moving toward our tent, slowly, deliberately, and the sound of the thrumming was so loud it was painful, and suddenly, the property damage began. Our tent fabric, a high-grade ripstop nylon, was cleanly sliced open, a massive tear from top to bottom, as if by a razor-sharp claw, and the dark figure was now standing right outside the shredded tent. and the threatening message wasn't spoken. It was written, scratched deeply into the aluminum pole of the tent frame, with what looked like a piece of glass or bone. FLMIGES trilogy, and below it an image of a crude stick figure camera being broken in half, and we grabbed what little gear we could, leaving the expensive audio unit. Realizing the terrifying truth, this wasn't a historical site, it was a trap, and the silence it craved was not just the absence of sound, but the absence of us. The escape and aftermath was a humiliating, terrifying retreat. We ran, stumbling blindly back through the bayou, the sweet smell of jasmine and rot replaced by the metallic tang of fear and swamp muck. And we didn't stop until we hit the distant highway, hitchhiking back to civilization. And the authority involvement was predictably dismissive. We filed a police report about the damaged gear, but the local police chief, a massive, quiet man, just listened to our frantic story about the silent plot and the shadow figure, and then calmly told us there was no recorded cemetery on that land, and that the ground was unstable and off limits, closing the case as vandalism by a local weirdo. And the unresolved questions haunt us, especially the question of Mr. Delacroix's true role in all of this, who knew exactly where we were going and exactly what was waiting there. The final, chilling end came when I tried to contact Mr. Delacroix at his advertised address, a crumbling shack on the edge of the bayou, and the host of authority figure was secretive about the location. He met me at the door, his eyes cold and knowing, and I asked him about the silent plot, the shadow, the writing on the tent pole, and he just smiled that thin, terrible smile and said, "The sleepers did not like your bright lights, did they?" And when I demanded to know what the silent plot really was, he leaned in, his breath smelling of decay, and whispered, "It is not a plot, Mr. Liam. It is a garden, and it only grows silence." And then he handed me a small, sealed envelope, and inside was a single tiny, perfectly formed cypress root, still damp with swamp muck, and wrapped around it was a faded, brittle piece of paper with a final message, written in the same crude script as the tent pole. "Debu ye steel heavy t sundi." And I know that our terror is still out there, recorded on that dead audio equipment, waiting for the silent plot to be played back. Story 4. The inheritance setup was a deep, unexpected trauma. My father, a quiet, scholarly man, died suddenly of a massive, inexplicable heart attack, leaving me, his only daughter, his entire estate, which was mostly books, strange artifacts, and a sprawling, ancient, and almost comically sinister-looking property. The Blackwood family estate, which included the private family crypt in the overgrown, local cemetery, and I was grief-stricken and overwhelmed, suddenly responsible for this massive, dark legacy. And my father was a hoarder of history, constantly collecting things, and I should have known better than to touch his things. But the need to understand the quiet mystery of his life, and his sudden death, drove me forward. My initial exploration of the estate was a chilling descent into his private obsession. I spent weeks going through his study, finding rooms filled with strange artifacts. But the heart of the collection was the private library, where I found the strange cemetery materials, boxes overflowing with detailed 18th century maps of every major graveyard in the region, and hundreds of small, polished obsidian plaques, each one carved with a unique, geometric symbol. And then I found the family ledger, a massive book bound in cracked, dry leather, and the pages weren't financial records. They were a chilling history of the Blackwood family's true role, a lineage of keepers of the vault, tasked with maintaining the seals on a dark, powerful presence buried deep beneath the crypt, a presence my father simply called the Sleeper. And I realized these obsidian plaques were not artifacts, but the seals themselves, and that my father's sudden death was not coincidence. The first manifestations began the moment I touched the ledger, dismissing the whole thing as a strange, elaborate game my father had played with history, but the incidents were too specific, too cold to ignore. The unexplained events began small, a sudden, powerful draft that slammed every door in the house shut at once, even when all the windows were closed, and then came the smells, a constant, faint scent of raw, wet earth and sulfur that seemed to emanate from the library floorboards, and the cold grew, an intensely localized cold that clung to my hands whenever I was in the library, and I started hearing whispers, not words but a low, continuous heavy sighing sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves, and I told myself it was the old house settling, the sounds of mice, anything to keep the fear at bay. But the signs were all there, whispering that the seals were breaking, that the sleeper was stirring. My research phase quickly turned into a terrified search for answers. I spent days locked in the library, desperately going through the ledger, trying to understand my family members' involvement with the vault. And the family history detailed a dark pact made centuries ago, a binding spell placed upon a creature of pure dread, a pact that required the family to maintain the obsidian seals and perform a complex, generational ritual of silence and respect, to keep it locked away. And the hidden secrets revealed in the ledger were sickening. My father's last entry was scribbled in frantic, shaky handwriting. I moved the seals. I tried to study the geometry. I broke the silence. It knows my name. It's taking my heart. And the awful realization was inescapable. My father hadn't died of a heart attack. He had been taken. And by accepting the inheritance, I had accepted the responsibility and the debt, and I knew, with chilling certainty, that I was next. The escalating activity was a direct, violent challenge to my existence. The whispers became louder, transforming into a guttural, furious groan that shook the house's foundation, and the physical events became undeniable. One night, I was standing in the study when the massive, brass chandelier above me suddenly dropped, crashing to the floor in a shower of metal and shattered crystal, missing me by inches. And the proof was real. The floor was covered in debris, and resting perfectly in the center of the wreckage was one of the small, obsidian seals, perfectly clean, placed there with deliberate intent. And the events were now affecting my daily life. The intense cold followed me everywhere, and I couldn't sleep, terrified of the silence that might be broken by the final groan. And I should have walked away, abandoned the house, the inheritance, the curse. But the terror was mixed with a deep, paralyzing sense of inherited responsibility, a cold obligation to keep the thing locked away, even if it meant my own destruction. My desperate solutions were pathetic attempts to reverse what was started. I tried to find the original burial site, the final core seal my father had written about, driving hysterically to the crypt in the cemetery. But the entire area was choked with ancient, thorny vines that seemed to coil and writhe as I approached, refusing to let me near the stone door. And then I tried to perform the ritual of silence, described in the ledger, a complex, precise process involving specific herbs and prayers spoken in a dead language. But the moment I started the prayer, the air filled with that sulfurous smell, and a massive, black shadow appeared in the corner of the library, not a shape, but a void, and I dropped the ledger, running, knowing I had only made it angrier. And my last desperate attempt was to call a local priest, who listened politely to my frantic, whispered story, and then calmly told me that the church could not intervene in matters of the true old ways, and that my family's debt was generational and non-negotiable. The ongoing curse is my perpetual, cold prison. I finally left the house, leaving everything behind, but the curse lingers, clinging to me like a shroud, and the consequences are permanent. I live in a sterile, modern apartment, but the intense cold is always there, focused right above my heart, a constant, dull ache that reminds me of my father's final moment, and the consequence is things that can't be undone. I can't look at maps. I can't stand the smell of moss or earth. And I know that the sleeper is free, that the seals are broken, and the permanent consequences are the subtle, constant signs that it is still feeding on my life. Just last week, I woke up to find a small, fresh, wet pile of raw earth on my pillow, and etched into the condensation on my bedroom window. In my father's familiar, frantic handwriting was a single chilling line. I had listed it, the silence is leaving you. And I know that the sleeper is out there, that the dead is still due, and that my life is slowly being drained to feed the emptiness beneath the Blackwood crypt. Story 5, the job setup came at the perfect, desperate moment. I was a former clean technician, specialized in hazardous waste and deep trauma cleaning, but a series of bad luck and a crushing divorce had left me financially ruined, living in a cheap motel and desperate for work. And the money wasn't worth it, but the bills were piling up. So when I saw the posting for high clearance, specialized sanitization technician at the ultra exclusive private sanctuary of perpetual rest. The pay was exorbitant, almost criminal, 3 times the going rate, and the only requirement was absolute discretion and a willingness to work from 2 a.m. to 7 a.m., an unusual opportunity that felt less like a job and more like a fever dream, and I took it, signing a massive, terrifyingly detailed, non-disclosure agreement before I even saw the facility. My first day was a lesson in unsettling luxury. The sanctuary of perpetual rest was a compound of towering, modern mausoleums surrounded by a massive, polished granite wall, and the security was intense, armed guards, retinal scans, and electronic checkpoints everywhere, and I met my co-workers, a crew of 5 men and women, all silent, all avoiding eye contact, and the initial training was chillingly sparse. My supervisor, a lean, severe man named the director, who spoke only in clipped, quiet commands, gave me the procedure. Use a specific, viscous, silver-colored cleaning agent. Apply it only to the exterior marble of the monuments, and never, under any circumstances, allow any of the cleaning agent to touch the ground. And he showed me the restricted areas, the entire perpetual garden, a central area enclosed by opaque glass, saying, the residents there require absolute, undisturbed rest, which made no sense for a cleaning job. But the money was too good to argue. The strange protocols were the foundation of the horror. The rules made absolutely no professional sense. We were required to wear full, sealed hazmat suits with oxygen tanks, even though the cleaning agent was supposedly non-toxic. And the director made it clear that the money wasn't worth it if you can't follow the rules. And the most bizarre rule was the no-light policy. All cleaning had to be done under specific, low-wattage blue UV lamps, making the white marble glow with a sickly, ethereal light, and the director was obsessive about the silence, making us use specialized, silent machinery, saying, they made it clear that any disturbance is unacceptable, and I should have walked away. The whole atmosphere was a terrifying battle between professional obligation and the basic instinct for personal safety. But the image of my overdue bills was a stronger, heavier chain than any fear. The coworker warnings were constant, subtle whispers in the changing room. Maria, one of the cleaners, cornered me one night by the massive, silver gate, her eyes wide with fear inside her hazmat hood, and she whispered into her radio mic, they hire us for the silence, not the cleaning. And when I asked her what she meant, she just repeated, the others, they tried to quit, they didn't get far. And Ben, an older man with a perpetual tremor in his hands, passed me a small, crumpled piece of paper, a single, terrifying line scrawled on it, Udu E each Silin CE. And the fear was a living thing in the building, the air thick with unspoken dread, and I knew that whatever was happening here, it was far more sinister than high-end janitorial work. And I started checking the locks on my hazmat suit, realizing the professional obligation to clean was a cover for a much deeper, more terrifying duty. The truth was revealed on a night I was cleaning a monument near the perpetual garden. I was applying the silver cleaning agent when I noticed a slight discoloration on the opaque glass wall of the garden, a small fist-sized area that was almost clear, and I wiped it clean with my gloved hand, and I saw what the job really involved. The garden wasn't a garden. It was a massive, shallow pit filled with raw, constantly churning earth. And there were bodies, dozens of them, pale and unnaturally pristine, suspended just beneath the surface, as if swimming in thick, wet mud, and they weren't buried, they were being preserved. Their faces locked in silent screams. And then, the topic horror, I saw the director, standing over the pit, pouring the viscous, silver cleaning agent not on the marble, but directly into the raw earth, and the ground responded. The earth moved, closing around a freshly added body with a grotesque, sucking sound, and I realized the cleaning agent wasn't for the marble. It was a preservative, a chemical agent to keep the occupants perpetual, and the residents were not resting. They were trapped, and we were the caretakers of a living, underground horror show, forced to maintain their terror. I was trapped immediately. I stumbled back from the glass, my heart hammering against the rigid plastic of my suit, and the director turned, his eyes locking onto my terrified face through my clear visor, and he smiled a slow, cold smile, and he calmly spoke into his radio mech. The new hire has reached the observation phase, and he made it clear that my escape was impossible. You signed the agreement, Jessica. The financial penalties are absolute, and your personal history is now part of our file. Your contract is for 5 years, no sick leave, no quitting, and I realized that my desperate need for money had signed away my freedom, and that I was forced participation, a cog in this terrible, eternal machine of perpetual rest. And the silence from my coworkers, the way they moved like ghosts, suddenly made horrible, sickening sense. They were just like me, trapped by the terrifying efficiency of the director's contract. My escape and consequences were brutal and desperate. I didn't quit, I broke. I completely sabotaged the facility's power grid during a shift, plunging the entire complex into absolute darkness, a frantic, high-risk distraction, and I made a run for the outer wall, climbing the towering granite, tearing my hazmat suit and my skin on the jagged edges, and I got out. But I am forever changed and marked by the experience. I live in constant fear, looking at every expensive building, every manicured lawn, and only seeing the horror beneath the surface. And the careered life permanently altered by the experience is the smallest part of the damage. I can't look at anything silver. I can't stand the smell of fresh earth. And the money I made is locked away, contaminated by the terror of its origin. And the chilling final consequence came last month. A fresh, terrifying threat. I received an official-looking letter, a thick, silver, embossed envelope, and inside was a blank contract, ready for renewal, and stapled to the contract was a single, tiny, perfectly preserved human tooth, resting on the clean white paper, and scrawled beneath the renewal line were the words, Th santiur recuires anendu segimentuari, The hazimet fispuel. And I know that the director is still out there, still watching, and that the sanctuary of perpetual rest is waiting patiently for the final addition to its garden. Story 6. My encounter setup began with the most routine of errands. I was a retired librarian, a creature of habit, and my everyday routine involved a morning visit to the town's historical archives, which meant a quiet walk through the sprawling, meticulously maintained Athord Garden Cemetery, a beautiful, serene place filled with classic Victorian stone monuments and ancient, twisted cedar trees, and I enjoyed the quiet, the history, the stillness of the place. But one overcast morning, my walk was interrupted by an unsettling anomaly, a perfect circle of violently black earth, about 3 feet wide, that had suddenly appeared right on the clean, white gravel path, and the circle was unnaturally dark, almost oily, and the grass bordering it was completely dead, and I stopped, my practical mind trying to find a reason, a chemical spill, a fungal bloom, but the geometry was too precise, and I felt a profound, cold chill that had nothing to do with the air. My initial curiosity overrode my better judgment. I couldn't leave the strange occurrence alone, and I stepped up to the circle, its surface oddly dry, and I bent down, trying to touch the black earth, but a powerful wave of static electricity snapped at my fingers, forcing me back, and I dismissed it as an electrical short somewhere underground. A trick of the mind, but the whispers started that evening, soft, hissing sounds that seemed to come from the antique grandfather clock in my hall, subtle supernatural hints, not words, but a rapid, rhythmic clicking sound, like someone scratching a needle over a record, and I told myself it was the clock mechanism failing, my hearing going bad, but the sound felt directed, personal, and I found myself jumping at shadows, looking over my shoulder, the faint, internal voice of doubt asking me if the isolation was finally getting to me. The first signs were deeply unsettling and tied directly to the cemetery. On my walk the next day, the black circle was gone, vanished, but I noticed that the marble face of one of the massive angel statues, the one I passed every day, was suddenly, inexplicably weeping, not water, but a thin, gray, oil-like substance that smelled distinctly of ozone and burnt metal. And the supernatural hunts grew intense. I started seeing fleeting shapes in the reflections of glass, tall, elongated figures that moved with unnatural speed, and the clicking from my grandfather clock intensified, now sounding like a furious, rapidly typing typewriter, tied to a sense of unbearable urgency, and I couldn't believe what was happening. My rational, ordered world was dissolving, and I spent hours frantically checking the clock, taking it apart, only to find the mechanism pristine, untouched, and the constant sensory overload, the smell of ozone, the rapid clicking, the feeling of cold dread, pushed my doubt about my sanity to the breaking point. The growing manifestations became a pure descent into terrifying sensory reality. A week later, I was woken in the middle of the night by a massive, violent sound, a deep, resonant crack that shattered the silence, and I walked into the hall, and the intense apparition was standing there. A figure of pure, negative space, a shadow that absorbed all the light in the room, and the air around it was an absolute 0-degree cold, and the sound was coming from its hands, which were impossibly long and tipped with sharp, black claws, and it was scratching, rapidly and fiercely, at the plaster wall, and I smelled the ozone, the burnt metal, overpowering everything. And the sensory overload was total, the cold, the sound, the smell, the sight, all crashing down on my mind. And I finally understood, with a sick certainty, that I wasn't hallucinating, and that the scratch marks it was making, deep, clean lines in the plaster, were undeniable proof that this thing was real, and it was here for a terrifying purpose. The revelation came the next morning. Shaking and terrified, I checked the wall, and the scratch marks were deep, clean, and real, and I noticed a pattern in the lines, a series of complex, repeating geometric shapes, and I rushed to the archive, desperately digging through the oldest, most obscure documents, and I finally uncovered the supernatural entity's true connection to the cemetery. A dark piece of forgotten folklore. The gardens were built over the site of an old, experimental electrical plant from the 1880s, and the area was said to be haunted by a generator spirit, a creature of pure, trapped energy that required constant input to sustain itself, and the black circle, the static, the ozone smell. It was all connected to this thing that was feeding on energy. And then I found the final, terrifying note, written by a caretaker in 1891. The spirit can only be drawn out when it is given a fresh anchor, a person who has crossed its path. And that's when it hit me. The black circle on the path was the trap, and I was the anchor, the power source it had chosen. The confrontation was brief, violent, and utterly overwhelming. That evening, the shadow was back, standing silently in the hall, and I didn't scream. I was too terrified. I just ran, trying to flee the anchor point. But the spirit moved with a terrifying, instantaneous speed, and the direct interaction was physical, a burst of violent, icy wind that slammed me against the wall, and I could feel the energy being drained from me, a heavy, sinking feeling in my chest, and I screamed out,
"I'm not the anchor!"
"I'm just a librarian." But the shadow only intensified, and I managed to fight my way out the front door, running into the street, collapsing on the cold pavement, and I was safe, for now. But the sheer power of the entity, the absolute cold, had left me completely spent, the encounter scaring my mind and body with the memory of pure dread. The lingering haunt is my constant, cold companion. I sold the house, left the city, and moved to a remote, sunny place. But the effects are ongoing. I suffer from constant, intense tremors, and the cold follows me everywhere. An intense, localized chill focused on my chest, and I am terrified of electricity, of anything that hums, and the chilling proof that the entity persists came just last week. I was sitting in my new living room, and a massive thunderstorm rolled in, shaking the windows, and as the lightning flashed, I saw it, on my clean, white wall, the shadow, a tall, elongated figure, and it was making the familiar, rapid clicking sound, and as the power went out, plunging the room into darkness, I saw the faintest, flickering glow of red light in its empty eyes, and a small, fresh, perfect circle of black, oily earth had appeared right on my clean, wooden floor. And I knew that the generator spirit had found its new anchor, and that the energy it craved was still mine to give. Story 7. My routine setup was driven by a new, exciting hobby. I was an amateur photographer obsessed with capturing the unique atmosphere of old, abandoned spaces, and my favorite location was the secluded Whispering Hills Memorial, a massive, sprawling cemetery famous for its incredible ironwork and intricate, almost surreal monuments. And I would spend hours there, quietly moving through the rows, finding the perfect angles, and my life was normal, quiet, until the day I realized my normal life involving this cemetery activity had become the object of someone else's terrifying obsession. And the peace I found in the silence of the graves was about to be shattered. The first notice of being watched started subtly, a feeling of unease that I initially dismissed as the natural creepiness of the location. I'd be setting up my tripod, completely alone in a quiet quadrant, and I would suddenly feel this intense prickle on the back of my neck, and I would turn, but only see the silent stones. But the minor coincidences became too frequent to ignore. I always carried a specific, vintage brass compass, a family heirloom, in my jacket pocket, and twice I found it resting on top of a tombstone in a section I had just passed, pointing due north. And then, the worst part, I noticed a subtle, distinct scent of pipe tobacco on the air, always faint, always gone the moment I inhaled deeply, but it was there. And I knew that someone was following me, watching me, and that my quiet hobby was no longer quiet. The escalating surveillance became chillingly direct. The feeling of being watched was constant, and one afternoon, I found clear evidence of stalking. A small, laminated photo of me, candidly taken from a distance while I was focusing my camera, tucked neatly into the leaves of a marble flower on a headstone, and the stalker used technology. The photo was high resolution, obviously taken with a powerful telephoto lens, and the scent of pipe tobacco was strong. And then came the terrifying notes, small pieces of vellum, folded into precise squares, left beneath specific monuments I had photographed. And the notes were not threats, but detailed critiques of my work. Your depth of field is flawless, but you missed the sorrow in her eyes, always referring to the marble angel statues. And the most disturbing sighting was the man himself, a tall, gaunt figure in a long, dark coat, standing perfectly still behind a massive obelisk, holding what looked like a vintage twin lens reflex camera. And he didn't run, he just stood there watching me. The terrifying distortion of my everyday routine complete. The identification of the motive was a horrifying realization. I sprinted back to my car, driving straight to the city's historical society, and I spent hours digging through old cemetery records, finally identifying the stalker's motive tied to the cemetery, a strange, old file on Ebenezer Crowe, a reclusive, obsessive 19th century cemetery photographer, famous for his chilling, beautiful photos of the dead. And the file stated that Crowe believed the statues in Whispering Hills were living anchors, the souls of the dead trapped in stone, and he was said to haunt the grounds, looking for the perfect successor, to continue his morbid work. And then I found the photo, a faded, terrifying portrait of Crowe himself, the man in the dark coat, the same man I had seen behind the obelisk. And that's when it hit me, the sickening truth. The stalker wasn't just interested in my photography. He was interested in my soul, believing I was the next vessel for his terrifying, static obsession. The chase sequence was a nightmare of evasion through the silent, oppressive monuments. I was taking photos near the massive, weeping statue known as the Widow's Kiss, when the scent of tobacco hit me, strong and suffocating, and I knew he was close. And the figure in the dark coat stepped out from behind a crypt, holding the antique camera, his face pale and unnervingly calm. And the pursuit began in the cemetery. Specific setting. I ran, scrambling over low iron fences and darting between the stone rows. And I could hear his quiet, rhythmic footsteps right behind me, not running, but a precise, calm walk. And the stalker used a specific, terrifying tool. He kept snapping photos with the vintage camera, and with every click, I felt a profound physical drain, a momentary paralysis that slowed me down, and I remember screaming. Looking back though, the signs were all there. The critiques, the photos, the smell. And I kept thinking that he wasn't chasing me to hurt me, but to trap me, to capture my final terror on his cold, glass plate. The resolution attempt was a desperate, panicked struggle. I managed to get out of the cemetery by throwing a handful of loose gravel at his camera lens, causing him to pause for a crucial second. And I didn't stop running until I reached the police station, seeking help from a skeptical, wary officer, and the police investigated the grounds, finding my abandoned camera gear. But the man was gone, and the only evidence was the lingering scent of old pipe tobacco, and the officer, seeing my frantic state, suggested I was suffering from exhaustion and stress, and the confrontation escape was messy, leaving me with the knowledge that the stalker was a ghost, a presence that the law couldn't touch, and the unresolved questions of his identity, or lack thereof, haunt my every waking moment. The continued vigilance is my permanent, cold reality. I moved, changed my identity, and gave up photography, terrified to look through a lens again. But the sense of surveillance never leaves, and the recent indications the stalker hasn't stopped are chillingly subtle. I was walking through a bookstore last week, miles away from Whispering Hills, when I found a small, dark object tucked into the pages of a book on 19th century photography, and it was a small, antique glass negative plate, and the image on the plate was of the widow's kisses statue, but the statue's eyes were now wide open, staring right at the camera, and etched into the corner of the plate was a fresh, faint inscription, Teeb Sarawes Ray Duai. And I know that Ebenezer Crow is still out there, that my terror is now part of his collection, and that he is patiently waiting for the day I finally pick up a camera again, ready to capture my final silent portrait. Story 8. The acquisition setup was deeply personal and rooted in a profound sense of loss. My favorite relative, my Uncle Silas, passed away suddenly, leaving me his beloved vintage coin collection, a truly valuable assortment of rare, ancient coins, and inside the collection's massive, velvet-lined box, I found an object that clearly didn't belong, a strange, beautiful, and deeply unsettling acquisition, a single black iron key, heavy and cold, tied with a piece of brittle dark cord, and the cursed object was clearly tied to the cemetery. Engraved on the thick iron head of the key was the crest of the city's oldest, most notorious burial ground, Old Man's Hill Cemetery, a place known for its centuries of dark history. And I should have known better than to touch it, but the key felt significant, a final mystery from my favorite relative, and the rush of curiosity was too strong to ignore. My initial fascination with the key was immediate and intense. I cleaned the iron meticulously, discovering that the key fit the lock of the ancient, heavily barred, private Blackwood family crypt at Old Man's Hill, a crypt that had been sealed for centuries, and I felt a strange, intoxicating pull to the object, carrying it everywhere. And I found that whenever I held the key, my luck seemed to soar. The positive effects were undeniable. I won a small lottery prize. I aced a job interview I was completely unqualified for, and I felt this intense, almost manic rush of confidence, and I became deeply attached to the object, sleeping with it under my pillow, the weight of the iron key a strange, cold comfort. And I convinced myself that this wasn't a curse, but a gift, a powerful talisman given to me by my late uncle. Anything to ignore the strange, cold dread that clung to the iron. The first curses started subtly, minor misfortunes that I desperately tried to blame on bad luck. Not the key. My small lottery prize vanished, stolen right out of my locked apartment, and I started experiencing intense, terrifying night terrors, dreams of being trapped in a cold, dark place, hearing a constant, faint, guttural scratching sound, and then the incident started to affect the people I loved. My younger brother was in a severe accident, a completely random, freak event that left him hospitalized, and the doctors couldn't explain how it happened, and I tried to talk to him, but he only spoke of the cold, saying that he kept seeing a dark shadow, standing at the foot of his bed, and I started to feel this growing, cold dread, the kind of dread that tells you that the life you are living is not your own. And I began to suspect that the key and the cemetery were connected in a trade, a cold exchange of my luck for the safety of those around me. The worsening effects became a terrifying, undeniable reality. My small misfortunes turned into catastrophic, life-changing incidents linked directly to the key and Old Man's Hill. The house I had just bought with my lucky money suddenly, mysteriously caught fire, burning down in minutes, and the fire marshal couldn't find a cause. But in the ashes, resting on the only piece of wood that wasn't charred, was the key, perfectly clean and cold. And the worst thing happened when my brother's health took a sharp, inexplicable turn for the worse, and he became unresponsive, and the last coherent words he wrote on a pad of paper were, "The keeper is calling me home." And the horror of the situation hit me. I wasn't lucky. I was the agent of a terrible, slow, cold drain, and the key was a tool of the cemetery, a focus point for a creature that craved not gold, but life, and I couldn't believe I had been so blindly obsessed with a piece of cold iron. The origin discovery was a terrifying race against time. I knew I had to get rid of the key, but first, I needed to know what it opened, and I used my uncle's old contacts, an underground network of historians and occultists, and I researched the curse's history, finding a dark, brutal legend about the Blackwood Crypt. And the key was the Key of Silence, a ritualistic tool made by a local 19th century cult. designed to open the crypt only for the purpose of exchanging a new, fresh life for the silence of the old dead. And the text said the key would draw the life force of its owner until the creature inside the crypt was satisfied, and the key would then be passed on to the next victim. And the most chilling part was a final, cryptic note from one of the cultists. The key only takes what is given freely, and it cannot be destroyed. And I knew that by taking the key, I had willingly stepped into the creature's cold, hungry grasp. The disposal attempt was a final, desperate act of defiance. I tried everything I could think of to destroy the key. First, I tried to melt it in a crucible, but the iron only glowed with a sickly, blue light, refusing to liquefy. And then, I tried to throw it into the deepest part of the local river, but the key simply floated back to the surface, pulled to the bank by an unseen force, and my final, desperate attempt to rid the object was to return it to Old Man's Hill. But when I reached the Blackwood crypt, the lock, which the key fit perfectly, had been removed, leaving only a dark, open hole in the stone. And as I stood there, holding the cold, heavy iron, a faint, deep guttural sound came from inside the crypt, a sound that was less a groan and more a cold, satisfied sigh. And I realized that the key wasn't needed anymore, that it had completed its task, and that I was now permanently bound to the crypt, the focus of the curse. The persistent curse is my constant, cold reality. I couldn't get rid of the key, so I sealed it inside a block of solid concrete and buried it deep beneath my parents' property. But the curse lingers, a terrifying, cold anchor in my life, and the persistent curse affects my current life irreversibly. I live in constant fear, waiting for the final, cold drain, and my brother is still in the hospital, kept alive by machines, his life force a final, terrible proof of the key's hunger. And the permanent consequences are the subtle, cold reminders that the key is still active. Just last night, I woke up to find the key, the one sealed in concrete, resting on my nightstand, perfectly clean, and tied to the dark cord was a small, white piece of paper, and written on it in what looked like the elegant, sloping handwriting of my late uncle was a final, chilling message. Thdbas yo ars, teach hrptima, feel xng. And I know that the key has returned home, and that the creature beneath Old Man's Hill is patiently, hungrily, waiting for me to turn the lock. Story 9. The trigger setup was my pursuit of ultimate understanding. I was a doctoral student in comparative mythology, and my thesis focused on the burial rites of isolated communities, and this led me to the remote, incredibly isolated Silent Valley Cemetery, a forgotten 18th century Huguenot burial ground, rumored to hold the remains of people who were buried alive. And my immersion in this grim topic was total. I spent weeks there, documenting the bizarre, heavy concrete slabs over the graves, and this immersion led to intense stress and isolation. I was eating poorly, sleeping less than 2 hours a night, trying to decipher the complex symbols carved into the stone, pushing myself to the absolute breaking point. And I should have walked away, but the drive for academic validation, the pressure to publish a groundbreaking paper, was a stronger, more corrosive force than any self-preservation instinct. The initial strain began with minor mental slips, the overwhelming fatigue from topic involvement making my grip on reality tenuous. I started having trouble reading the symbols, confusing the Latin inscriptions with my own tired scribbles, and I would spend hours staring at the concrete slabs, convinced I could hear a faint, dull scratching sound coming from beneath them, a rhythmic tap. Tap, tap that seemed to match the beat of my own frantic heart, and my internal monologue became a constant, cruel judge, a voice that insisted my work was fraudulent, that the stone was moving, that I wasn't just tired, I was weak, and I started seeing movement in my peripheral vision, quick, desperate flashes of pale hands disappearing beneath the cracked slabs. But every time I turned, there was nothing, only the cold, hard, silent concrete. The hallucinations begin with a terrifying, absolute loss of reality. I was standing over a massive, unmarked concrete slab, trying to translate a final, complex symbol, when I looked down at my notebook, and the blur of reality with topic-induced visions was complete. The symbol in my sketch was no longer a complex knot. It was a perfectly rendered human face, screaming in silent agony, and I stared at the drawing, horrified, knowing I hadn't drawn it, and then the sound started, not whispers, but a loud, terrified thumping sound coming from right beneath my feet, a sound of heavy, frantic struggle, and the air around me felt thick, suffocating, and I heard a voice, muffled, choked with dust, say, "Itmo Ute Silara," and I couldn't believe what was happening. I dropped my notebook, scrambling backward, and the doubt about my sanity began, a freezing certainty that the concrete was moving, that the dead were struggling, and the scariest part was the voice sounded exactly like my own, distorted and panicked, trapped and clawing for release. The deep descent was a total, terrifying break from the real. Every time I went near the silent valley, the visions became more vivid, more real. I saw the thick, concrete slabs vibrating, pulsing with a slow, sickening rhythm. And I would find small, white, perfectly preserved fingernails scattered on the edges of the graves. But when I tried to pick them up, they dissolved into dust, and I was fully confused. Unable to tell real threats from illusions, I saw the entire graveyard come to life one night, the grass waving as if 1,000 bodies were struggling beneath the surface. And I saw a woman, her face covered in dried mud, standing at the edge of the cemetery, waving a small, dirt-caked hand at me, and I ran toward her, convinced she was a real person, trapped. But she dissolved into a pile of gray dust as I approached, and I realized the threat was real, or at least, my mind believed it was real, and the constant thumping, the internal voice, the panic, made the whole world a vast, cold concrete box, and I stopped eating, stopped drinking, terrified that by sleeping, I would become one of the trapped. The external help was a violent, necessary intervention. My academic advisor, Dr. Elms, worried about my increasingly erratic emails, finally drove out to the Silent Valley, finding me sitting on a concrete slab, arguing heatedly with the ground, insisting that I could hear a woman screaming my name, and he immediately called the police, describing my condition to friends experts, who were horrified by my physical state and my frantic, paranoid ramblings, and they intervened, rushing me to the psychiatric ward. And I remember fighting them, screaming that they couldn't take me, that the sleepers were angry, and that the concrete was closing in, and the doctors diagnosed me with extreme catatonic paranoia, brought on by exhaustion and trauma. And the first few months were a blur of medication and confusion, the internal monologue slowly being silenced, the thumping fading to just a memory, but the images, the screaming face, the pale, clawing hands, were burned into my mind. The partial recovery left me questioning every moment of my descent. After months of intense therapy and medication, I was released, stable, functional, but profoundly scarred. And the biggest question was, what was the trigger? Was it the exhaustion, or was the exhaustion the weakness that let something real through? I went back to the Silent Valley once, on a controlled visit with a therapist, and everything looked normal, quiet, peaceful, but I felt the coldness, the silence, and I noticed that the massive, unmarked concrete slab I had been studying had a new small, perfectly clean crack running straight down its center, like a single, final sigh of release, and I knew that something had escaped, that my breakdown had been its opportunity, and I abandoned my thesis, terrified to look at the symbols again, terrified of the knowledge I had gained. The recurring episodes are a constant, terrifying reality. I haven't had a full breakdown since, but the episodes are tied to the cemetery, a recent relapse that reminds me the cold silence is still with me. I was walking through a busy downtown park last month, far away from the Silent Valley, and I looked down at the sidewalk, and I saw a tiny, perfect, white human fingernail resting innocently on the concrete, and I instantly felt the coldness, the panic, and the voice, the internal monologue, came back, clear and cold, whispering, still running, "Clara? The concrete is comfortable, and the doubt about my full recovery is constant. I now take 3 different anti-psychotic medications, a final, desperate wall against the creeping paralysis, and the most recent episode was just 2 days ago. I was looking through a box of old academic materials, trying to throw them away, and I found the notebook, the one I had dropped in the Silent Valley, and on the final page, scrawled in my own, frantic handwriting, was a single, terrifying line that I never remembered writing. "Tshwire, not deed. To wire just eslo. And to okano nem." And I know that the sleeper is free, that the concrete is broken, and that the silence it craves is still mine to give. Story 10. The isolation setup was intentional and intensely focused. I was an extreme weather photographer, specializing in capturing the beauty and terror of remote, hostile environments, and I had been hired to document the Great Blizzard of '78, specifically the areas around the massive, abandoned Pine Ridge Memorial, a remote cemetery located deep in the High Plains wilderness, a place notoriously difficult to access, and the topic environment was a terrifying blend of nature and decay, and I was stranded or trapped by my own ambition, hiking in alone, hours from the nearest civilization, carrying nothing but my camera gear, a minimal survival pack, and a satellite phone, convinced that the juxtaposition of the ancient gravestones and the brutal snowstorm would be the ultimate photo essay. Ready to prove my skill and endurance, my initial assessment was driven by survival strategies specific to the extreme cold. I took stock of my thermal gear, rationing my food and fuel, planning my survival around the massive, central mausoleum, a granite structure that offered the only real shelter, and the challenge was immense. The ground was frozen solid, making digging for cover impossible, and the cemetery itself was a terrifying labyrinth of waste, high drifts and ancient, tilting headstones, and my primary concern was the cold, the absolute, paralyzing cold that made every movement an agonizing decision, and I felt in control, charting my path from monument to monument, setting up a small, insulated camp inside the main mausoleum. Proud of my resourcefulness, the exhaustion a temporary price for the ultimate shot. The first challenges were environmental, quickly followed by the profound and terrifyingly personal. The weather intensified violently, the wind howling with a sound that was less nature and more a terrified scream. And the environmental threats were tied to the cemetery. The snow, which should have been soft and powdery, was hard, dense, and oddly dark, smelling faintly of sulfur and wet cloth. And then the noise started, a low, constant, terrifying sound that seemed to come from the snowdrifts themselves, a sound like heavy, wet blankets being dragged across the ground, and I told myself it was the wind, the settling of the snow, anything but the implied human intelligence behind the sound, and I should have been surprised when the final, thick coil of my high-grade climbing rope, my only means of self-rescue, went missing from my locked pack, vanished into the endless white. But I just felt a cold dread, a terrifying intuition that something was actively ensuring I would not leave. The escalating dangers were immediate and intensely physical. I was already fighting hypothermia, my fingers numb and useless, and I realized the cold was wrong. An unnaturally intense cold that radiated from the center of the cemetery, and then the pursuits began. I heard the dragging sound getting closer, slower, more deliberate, and I saw the tracks. Massive, unnatural depressions in the snow, not animal tracks, but large, bare footprints, and the worsening conditions became a nightmare of pursuit. The wind died down, and the dragging stopped, replaced by a slow, guttural coughing sound, wet and heavy, coming from just outside the mausoleum door, and I grabbed my camera, aiming it at the door. And the last thing I saw before I ran was the sound of my emergency radio being smashed against the marble floor. A final, clear sign of intelligent, malicious intent, and I realized I wasn't just in a storm. I was being hunted by something that the storm had woken. The desperate measures I took were risky, agonizing, and driven by pure, animalistic survival. I didn't wait for morning. I ran scrambling out of the mausoleum, armed only with my small pocket knife and a handful of emergency flares, and I ran blindly through the dense snowdrifts, and the pursuit was relentless. The heavy, wet coughing sound right behind me, and I used my survival techniques specific to the cemetery. I ran across the tops of the massive, flat family crypts, hoping to create distance from the thing that was struggling through the deep snow below. And I used a flare, igniting the magnesium, throwing the brilliant, blinding light at the cough, and I saw it, a massive, shrouded figure, moving with a terrible, slow, wet struggle, its face obscured by a thick layer of dark, burial cloth, and I screamed out, looking back though. That was the moment the cold took over, and I became nothing but a photograph. And I pushed past the pain, knowing that stopping meant being absorbed into the cold, silent white. The rescue or escape was a brutal, scaring ordeal. I ran until I collapsed, falling into a deep, protected crevice between two massive family monuments, and I lay there for hours, slowly freezing, before I managed to use my last bit of energy to activate the satellite phone's emergency beacon, and I was found 12 hours later by a search and rescue team, almost completely encased in ice. Hypothermic, frostbitten but alive. I had broken free, but I was scarred, physically and emotionally, and I was taken to a burn unit, treated for severe frostbite that mirrored the shape of the strange tracks, and the ongoing trauma is a constant, cold presence. I had to amputate 3 fingers. My career is over, and the thought of snow, or even a cold draft, sends me into a crippling state of terror. And the recent triggers reminding me of the ordeal are the worst part. I can't stand the smell of old cloth, and the permanent scar that reminds me every day is the massive, circular scar on my back, a perfectly round area of dead, white tissue that defies medical explanation, and the final sign that the ordeal isn't over came just last week. I received a small, unmarked box in the mail, and inside was the spool of my missing climbing rope, perfectly clean, and tied to the rope was a small, white piece of silk, and written on it in a dark, wet ink were the words, "The is coming jam, TB's marred whites," and I know that the silent cold is still out there, that it waited for me to leave Pine Ridge, and that it is patiently waiting for the next snowstorm to finally claim the silence it was denied.